It usually doesn't start with something obvious. There's no dramatic moment, no loud sound, no clear shape standing in front of you. It begins much more quietly than that. You're just doing something normal, sitting in a dim room, walking down a hallway, maybe standing in the kitchen late at night when everything feels slightly too still. And then it happens. A shadow shifts, not in a way you can immediately prove, not in a way you could confidently point to later. It's fast, almost subtle, like a flicker at the very edge of your vision, the kind of thing your brain tries to dismiss before you even fully register it. But you did register it, and that's where the unease begins. Human vision is not uniform. What you see clearly in front of you is only a small part of how your eyes actually work. The rest is handled by peripheral vision, an older, more primitive system, designed not for detail, but for detecting change, movement, threat, anything that might require instant attention. It doesn't ask for confirmation. It reacts first. That's why these experiences are so unsettling. Because the moment you turn your head to check, the detail's gone. Whatever your peripheral vision thought it detected collapses instantly under closer inspection. The shadow is just a shadow again. The corner is just a corner. The hallway is just empty space. But your body doesn't fully reset with that realization. There's a brief physiological reaction that lingers, a slight spike in alertness, a moment of tension that doesn't match the environment anymore. It feels like your senses briefly disagreed with each other, and for a second, the wrong one won. And this is important, because it sets the foundation for everything that follows in these experiences. From this point onward, your brain starts paying more attention to the shadows than it normally would, not consciously, but automatically. The visual system becomes more sensitive to contrast, movement, and darkness in the periphery. It begins scanning for that same pattern again, trying to confirm what it thought it saw, even if nothing is there. This is where the phenomenon begins to take shape, not as something external appearing in the room, but as something internal beginning to tune itself toward uncertainty. And once that tuning starts, the shadows stop being just shadows in your perception. They start becoming something your mind is actively watching. Once that first moment of uncertainty happens, many people don't interpret it as a visual glitch or a misread signal. They interpret it as presence. Across different cultures and time periods, there's been a long-standing belief that darkness is not empty, it is inhabited. In folklore and modern paranormal accounts, moving shadows are often described not as tricks of light, but as a category of entity that exists specifically at the edge of human perception. These are commonly referred to in modern paranormal communities as shadow figures, but the idea itself appears in older traditions, long before that name existed. What makes these reports so consistent is not just the idea of a shape in darkness, but the behavior people describe. These shadows are rarely seen directly. Instead, they appear briefly in transitional moments, passing a doorway, standing just outside a room's light, or appearing behind reflective surfaces for only a second before vanishing when attention is fully directed toward them. That disappearing under observation pattern is one of the reasons these experiences feel so unsettling. It creates a contradiction. Something was clearly perceived, but it cannot be confirmed. Within paranormal interpretation, this is often explained as an intelligence that exists outside normal physical interaction. Some theories suggest these entities do not fully occupy our visible spectrum, which is why they appear as silhouettes or undefined forms. Others describe them as beings that are only partially present in our reality, briefly intersecting with human perception without fully manifesting. One of the most widely discussed figures in this category is the Hat Man, a tall, dark, humanoid shape often described with a wide-brimmed hat and long coat-like outline. Reports of this figure are unusually consistent across different countries, age groups, and time periods, often accompanied by feelings of intense dread or paralysis. While these accounts vary in detail, they share a common emotional pattern. the sense that the presence is aware of the observer. Paranormal researchers often connect these experiences to liminal states, moments when the mind is transitioning between wakefulness and sleep, or when the environment is quiet enough for perception to become highly sensitive. In these states, they argue, the boundary between internal fear and external reality becomes blurred. From this perspective, shadows are not just optical phenomena. They are interpreted as a kind of interface, something that becomes noticeable only when conditions are right for human awareness to detect it. Skeptics, of course, point out that no physical evidence has ever confirmed the existence of shadow entities. There are no consistent recordings, no measurable traces, and no repeatable observations under controlled conditions. But what keeps the idea alive is the consistency of the experience itself. People who have never spoken to each other, describing remarkably similar sensations, shapes, and emotional responses. Whether these accounts reflect something external or something deeply internal remains unresolved. But in the dark, when the room is quiet and your attention is already focused on the edges of what you can see, that distinction doesn't feel nearly as clear as it does in daylight. If we step away from the paranormal interpretation for a moment, the phenomenon of moving shadows becomes less mysterious in one sense, but arguably more unsettling in another. Because what changes isn't the environment, it's the way the brain interprets it. Vision is not a direct recording of the world. It is a reconstruction. Your eyes collect incomplete information, and your brain fills in the gaps using context, memory, and expectation. The system is fast and efficient, but it is not perfect, especially under low light conditions, when detail is limited. In darkness, the visual system relies heavily on contrast rather than clarity. That means your brain is constantly trying to decide whether a faint change in brightness is meaningful or random. A slight shift in lighting across a wall, a reflection from a passing vehicle outside, or even the gradual adjustment of your eyes to darkness can all be interpreted as motion. This is where the illusion begins to form. One of the key mechanisms involved is motion detection in the visual cortex. The brain is highly sensitive to movement because, from an evolutionary standpoint, movement often meant danger. A rustle in tall grass could signal a predator. A sudden shift in the environment required immediate attention. So the brain evolved to prioritize motion detection, even when visual information is incomplete. The downside is that this system is prone to false alarms. In low-light environments, the brain can detect motion where none exists, simply because small changes in light intensity or contrast are being processed as movement. This is especially common in peripheral vision, where visual resolution is significantly lower than in the center of gaze. At the same time, another process is happening in parallel. The brain is attempting to organize ambiguous shapes into recognizable forms. This is where pareidolia becomes important. When visual input is unclear, the mind tends to impose familiar structures onto randomness. In darkness, that often means interpreting vague shapes as human-like silhouettes or figures. So when someone says they saw a shadow move, what is often happening is a combination of two systems misfiring at once: motion detection, flagging a harmless change in light, and pattern recognition attempting to assign meaning to it. There is also a timing factor that increases the likelihood of this experience. Fatigue plays a major role. As the brain becomes tired, its ability to filter irrelevant sensory input weakens. This makes it easier for minor visual fluctuations to be misclassified as significant events. The quieter and darker the environment, the more noticeable these misclassifications become. Importantly, none of this requires anything supernatural to produce a convincing experience. A stable environment can still feel unstable if the observer's perception is operating under low information conditions. And once the brain interprets a moment as movement, it doesn't easily undo that conclusion. Even after confirming nothing is there, the emotional response remains slightly elevated, making the next ambiguous shadow more likely to be noticed and more likely to feel meaningful. This creates a subtle feedback loop, not of external activity, but of internal interpretation becoming more sensitive with each perceived event. Even if the brain is primed to misinterpret signals, it still needs something in the environment to trigger the experience in the first place. And in most cases, that trigger is not random. It's physical, repeatable, and constantly changing in ways we rarely notice. Light is the first major factor. Most indoor lighting is not stable. Even what feels like a steady lamp or overhead bulb is actually fluctuating slightly due to electrical current, bulb temperature, and surrounding interference. These fluctuations are usually too small to consciously notice, but in darker conditions, they can subtly shift how shadows behave on nearby surfaces. A shadow might appear to stretch or recede, not because the object casting it has moved, but because the light source itself has changed intensity for a fraction of a second. Then there is the role of external light sources. Even in a closed room, light is constantly leaking in from outside, passing car headlights, street lights, signage, or distant lightning. These moving sources can cause shadows indoors to shift in ways that feel unconnected to any visible cause. Because the change is indirect, the brain often fails to link the movement to its actual source, leaving only the perception of motion behind. Spatial geometry also plays a hidden role. Rooms are filled with uneven surfaces, curved objects, reflective materials, partially obstructed corners. Shadows behave differently depending on these shapes, often bending or elongating in ways that do not match intuitive expectations. In narrow hallways or cluttered spaces, multiple overlapping shadows can interact, briefly creating the illusion of independent movement when light angles shift even slightly. There is also a less obvious environmental contributor: micro-movement within the space itself. Buildings are not static. They respond constantly to temperature changes, wind pressure, and even internal heating systems. Walls expand and contract slightly. Floors settle, doors shift by fractions of a millimeter. These movements are far too small to notice directly, but they can alter how light interacts with edges and corners, producing the impression that a shadow has changed position without any visible cause. Finally, timing amplifies everything. Most of these experiences occur at night, when artificial lighting replaces natural light and environmental cues are reduced. In these conditions, contrast becomes stronger, edges become less defined, and visual ambiguity increases. The brain receives less contextual information, which makes even minor environmental changes feel exaggerated. When all of these factors combine, unstable light, subtle structural movement, shifting external illumination, and reduced visual clarity, the environment itself becomes a kind of illusion generator. Not because anything unusual is happening in a supernatural sense, but because normal physical processes are constantly interacting in ways that are difficult for perception to fully decode in real time. At this point, the scientific explanation seems complete. We have perception errors, environmental shifts, and brain systems designed to misinterpret ambiguous information in low light. On paper, it all makes sense, but that still leaves one important question unanswered. Why does it feel like something is there? Even when someone understands every scientific mechanism behind shadow misperception, the experience itself often doesn't change. The moment still feels intentional. The movement still feels directed. And the memory of it tends to linger far longer than the explanation does. This is where psychology and storytelling begin to overlap. Human memory is not a recording device. It is reconstructive. Each time a memory is recalled, it is slightly reshaped by emotion, attention, and context. If an experience happens in a moment of fear or uncertainty, the emotional intensity becomes embedded into how the memory is stored. Later, Even when the rational explanation is clear, the emotional imprint remains unchanged. That is one reason shadow experiences feel persistent across time. The memory is not just about what was seen, it is about how it felt to see it. There is also a cultural layer that influences interpretation. From early myths to modern media, darkness has consistently been associated with presence, watching, and hidden intent. Stories across different eras have trained the mind to associate low visibility with unknown entities. This doesn't create the experience, but it shapes how the experience is categorized once it happens. So, when someone sees a shadow shift unexpectedly, the brain doesn't interpret it in isolation. It places it into an existing framework, one that often already includes ideas of something watching or moving beyond perception. This is where the boundary between explanation and interpretation becomes blurred. Science explains the mechanisms behind the illusion, but it does not erase the emotional response that follows it. And paranormal interpretations give structure to that emotional response, even if they don't provide measurable evidence. So the phenomenon exists in two parallel forms at once. One is mechanical, light, perception, and neural processing interacting under low visibility conditions. The other is experiential, the deeply human feeling that something in the darkness has just acknowledged you. And neither one fully cancels the other out in real time. That is why shadow movement remains such a persistent mystery in human experience, not because it resists explanation, but because explanation and experience operate on two different systems inside the mind. One understands what is happening, the other decides what it felt like happened. And in the dark, the second one usually speaks first.